So I know a history talk before lunch is not necessarily what everybody wants. I didn't make up the schedule, Dr. Washik did. But I think there is things that we can learn. And I think it sort of fits into the overall theme of the meeting. I'm certainly going to talk about old dogma, not necessarily going to teach you new tricks. But I think history not only should teach us about the past, it should give us some insight into the present. And I'm going to try and do that. It's a very sophisticated crowd here. I'm setting the bar high that I'm going to change the way you think of anesthesiology. I'm not sure that I can do that. But I do want to talk about a couple of myths. And I think, even though it's a very sophisticated audience, I bet all of you, or most of you, have fallen for some of these, maybe more than one of them. And I want to expose them during my talk. So I have no disclosures beyond the fact that I can't advance my slides properly. No financial disclosures. I do have a confession. I am not a historian. I'm an anesthesiologist. That's all I am. Why am I talking about history? Shouldn't a historian be giving this talk? History is essentially a story, the elements of a story, who, what, where, and when. Historians are really, really good at that. And they know what happened, who did it, where they did it. To add context to that, particularly with medical things, why did something get developed when it got developed? How did that address a clinical gap that existed at that time? They tend not to be as good at because they don't understand the medicine. They don't necessarily understand the science behind it. So for what I do, I think maybe it's actually better not to be a historian. True historians will sometimes make fun of physicians that do history of medicine. They say that we write hero worship pieces, great men and women who did great things. Yeah, we're guilty of that sometimes. But I think for the why and the how, we sometimes have something to add to it. I want to follow a simple question through history, and that question is, how much anesthesia am I administering? Well, that's easy. You look at your gas analyzer, it tells, well, what if you didn't have a gas analyzer? This is from the National Archives. It's entitled CRNA Administering Ether Anesthesia. That's all we know about it. Doesn't give us a date. She's using a Schimmelbusch mask, so we know it's at least after 1889. You can tell by looking at the ether can that it's going to be 1930 or later. That's actually the copper-protected ether can. The copper prevented peroxide formation in the ether that made it more explosive, made it less likely the anesthesia was going to blow up in your face when you open the can. But what we're really looking at is this kind of irregular wet spot. And how do you measure how much anesthesia that is? Is it the number of applications? Is it the number of drips? Do you need to have it in a special bottle where all the drips are kind of uniform? Can you do it right out of the can, a splish, a splash? Can you measure the anesthesia meaningfully that way? Is it perhaps the size of the wet spot? That looks like it's the size of a silver dollar. Would a dollar of anesthesia tell you something versus a quarter or maybe a nickel or something like that? There's a lot of things you can measure, but what you measure really has to be meaningful, right? And a lot of that wouldn't be meaningful. You also need it to be clinically relevant. And if it isn't clinically relevant, why would you measure it? And you have to be very practical in doing this. You have limited technology. A lot of this is being done in people's homes and things like that in the beginning. Even if you had a mass spec, obviously you couldn't drag it to somebody's house to use it to measure your anesthesia. And when you're looking at old photographs and old paintings and things, you got to be careful about the bias you may have from modern times. You look at that face being covered, and you might initially think, well, that's a HIPAA thing. They're protecting the identity of that patient. Obviously, HIPAA didn't exist back then. They were worried about ether getting in the eyes, causing corneal abrasions and things like that. I like to read first-person accounts. It's kind of a hobby, old textbooks, old medical journals, diaries, personal letters. I like that because it tells me what people are thinking. And I really like to know what people are thinking in history. Visual records like photographs and art, show us what people are doing. And with this specialty, it's always been true that people do things a little differently than maybe they're supposed to. And the manual for something doesn't necessarily tell you what people are really doing with it. So pictures help. If you have catalogs for instruments, that sometimes helps, but a lot of those don't exist. They didn't get saved. So where do we start our journey? Let's start with the famous painting, the first operation under ether, the Hinckley painting. Probably all of you are very, very familiar with this. Hangs in the Harvard Library. It was created about 40 years after the actual event, but it depicts the first demonstration of ether by Thomas Morden. This is the inhaler that Morden allegedly used. It's on display at the Ether Dome. If you read the sign, you might think it's actually the very inhaler that he used. It's not. The original is lost to history, probably broke, destroyed. We're not sure how close this is actually to the original one. But there was a problem with this inhaler. And you could put somebody to sleep, but you couldn't keep them asleep. It worked for a couple minutes, then they woke up. And maybe that's all anesthesia was. Who knew? Maybe it was a trick that you played on the brain, but the brain recovered, and we weren't going to be able to give anesthesia for an extended period of time. What was the problem with the inhaler? You could add more ether to it, and you still couldn't keep the patient asleep or put them to sleep. Well, when something vaporizes, right, takes heat. You have heat of vaporization. Pressure is going to be proportional to temperature, the ideal gas law. As the temperature in that vaporizer falls, the partial pressure of the gas is going to fall, and you're delivering less ether. So it didn't necessarily keep patients asleep for an extended period of time. It's made of glass, which is not a great conductor of heat, right? That's why we use them in windows in our house. If you look at the replica of this painting, which was created at a recreation of the Ether Day at Mass General for the, I guess, the 100th anniversary, 150th anniversary. If you look at how the actor portraying Morden is holding that inhaler, he's holding it underneath, right? So you might be tempted to think there's a lot of contact between his hand and the inhaler, and maybe there's some body heat getting into that inhaler that way, even though glass is not a great conductor of heat. But if you look at the schematics, it's really not a flat bottom. It's a curved bottom, sort of like a champagne bottle. Makes it a little stronger, but the hand's actually touching very little of that glass, and there's an insulating layer of air there. So heat really isn't getting into this device. The first myth that I want to talk about is that after the Morden's demonstration of ether, the use of anesthesia became commonplace and surgery painless. And that's what they tell us, right? The fact is, without specialized training and equipment or a basic understanding of anesthetic principles, early attempts at administering anesthesia produced inconsistent and unsatisfactory results. We're kind of led to believe that Morden showed us how to use ether. You didn't have to know anything. The ether just did the work. You smell the ether, the patient went to sleep. And in the days or weeks after that demonstration, everybody started getting ether, and surgery was suddenly painless. The common analogy is between anesthesiology and being a pilot. This is a picture of the Wright brothers demonstrating the concept of flight. Flight went for, I think, 10 seconds, went about 120 feet. Nobody really thinks that after the Wright brothers, in the days or weeks after that, suddenly there was air travel and families were packing their bags and going to LaGuardia and flying to Disney World or something like that. You're far, far away from having commercial flight there, right? You got to have an engine on that plane, you got to have wheels, you got to have a more comfortable thing than lying on the wing. Maybe a pressurized cabin, you've got to be able to carry baggage. You want the little light that calls the stewardess. You've got to develop all those things. How far away from commercial air travel are we on the day that the Wright brothers demonstrated flight? Well, the answer is 10 years, exactly. 10 years to the day, the first commercial airline was chartered. It had its first flight about 3 weeks later. It was the St. Petersburg-Tampa airboat line. What they did is they took one of those airboats that goes across the swamp with a big fan on the back. They put an extra fan on it. They put some Wright brother wings on it, and they were able to fly across Tampa Bay. Had an average cruising altitude of 5 feet, didn't get all that high. Couldn't take any baggage, could only take one passenger. But why would you do this? Well, let's see if I can use the pointer. These bridges didn't exist, so to get from Tampa Bay to St. Petersburg, you had to drive all that way. And in that year, that was about a 24-hour drive, and you could fly across Tampa Bay in 23 minutes. So a recreation of the Wright brothers. This is actually for the 100th anniversary. It's a recreation photo. Chuck Yeager breaking the sound barrier. 44 years. 44 years, that's all it took. And in that 44 years, you have commercial air travel, you're crossing the Atlantic, you're reducing the time it takes to cross the Atlantic from weeks to hours. You have Pearl Harbor, Midway, the Battle for Britain. Air travel is changing the world in dramatic ways, some of them good, some of them bad, but a huge amount of progress in 44 years. Compare that to the progress that anesthesiology makes in 44 years. And anesthesiology is supposedly simple. Nobody thinks air travel simple. So this is the story of Morden. I've redacted the person name here because I'm going to question whether it's right or not, and that's kind of rude. But he's the director of the History of Medicine Center. He's a distinguished professor of the history of medicine. I'm not a professor of the history of medicine. I'm not a distinguished professor of anything. But the way he tells the story, it was there on October 6, 1846, that a dentist named William T.G. Morden administered an effective anesthetic to a surgical patient, consenting to what became a most magnificent scientific revolution, where John Warren, an apprehensive surgeon, and Glenn Abbott, an even more nervous young man about to undergo removal of a vascular tumor on the left side of his neck. Both Warren and Abbott sailed through the procedure painlessly, although some have noted that Abbott moved a bit near the end. Turning away from the operating room table toward the gallery packed with legitimately dumbstruck medical students, Dr. Warren gleefully exclaimed, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." This is the way I heard the story. This is probably the way all of you have heard this story. Has anybody heard this story any differently? Nope. This is the way it happened, right? This is what they tell us. So this was published in what is the New England Journal of Medicine. It was then the Boston Journal of Surgery and Medicine. A recent survey of readers in the New England Journal said, hey, this is the most significant article ever published in the most significant journal that we have. So let's take a look and read it in the original. It's about anesthesiology. Why shouldn't we do that? So you read in the original, the present operation was performed by Dr. Warren, and although competitively slight, involved an incision near the lower jaw of some inches in extent. During the operation, the patient muttered, as in a semi-conscious state. He talked in his sleep. That's cute. I didn't know that. And afterwards stated the pain was considerable. The pain was considerable. That's not what they tell us, though mitigated. Okay, it must be the fact that it was mitigated that makes it so significant. In his own words, as though the skin had been scratched by a hoe. So, as a farmer tills a field, imagine if the earth could feel the farmer gouging at the field. That's what it felt like. The surgeon was gouging at my face like it was a farmer plowing a field. The era of painless surgery was actually considerably painful surgery, the patient's own words, maybe not nearly as bad as it used to be, but considerably painful. Even for an anesthesiologist of my modest skill, That's a humbug, right? If you had a patient, they woke up and said, oh, I felt the surgeon, gouging at my face the whole time, I'm not going to be happy with that. Why was the surgeon so happy with that? Well, actually, the patient didn't really move. That's what makes surgeons happy, and it made that surgeon happy. He must have moved a little bit. He's talking. You would think if you're operating on the jaw and someone's talking, that's probably inconvenient. But if you look at John Warren's diary from that day, and we're told, oh, he knew this was a revolution in medicine, everything had changed, the field of surgery was going to be forever different. His diary from that day, in the morning, went to the medical college to make some experiments on the renovation of decayed bones with glue. White glue gives some cases a beautiful appearance, and the black glue gives great strength. Did an interesting operation at the hospital in the morning while the patient was under the influence of Dr. Morton's preparation to prevent pain. The substance employed was sulfuric ether. So 36 words about the vexing problem of my medical students are breaking my skeletons. Should I use the pretty glue or the strong glue? And 30 words about the world changing forever with regard to surgery for what he described kind of subtly as, this is interesting. So it's not clear to me that he recognized that this was a game changer that forever changed the specialty of surgery. He did recognize that it was ether, and Morton had tried to disguise that fact, and that little ruse clearly didn't last that long. So when I think about what I want in a vaporizer, I want to know what I'm giving, I want to know how much I'm giving. I want to be able to adjust it, dial it up, dial it down as I need to. Can't do that with anything we've talked about. It's got to be simple, practical, versatile. It's got to be portable and maintainable. We're nowhere there yet. So how does the information about ether cross the Atlantic? Well, it's actually conveyed in a letter from Dr. Joseph Bigelow to one of his friends in London. Letters sent on November 28th. That's like 6 weeks after Ether Day. Took him a while to write that. Maybe there wasn't all that much interest in this. He reported multiple surgeries with ether. Some of them had gone better than the first one. Some of them were painless, not all of them. He included a copy of a newspaper, which is kind of, I'm going to prove this is really happening. It's in the newspaper. It must be true. The letter went across the Atlantic on the RMS Acadia. It was a Royal Mail ship. Departed Cunard dock on December 3rd. It's a 2-week voyage. It had 89 crew and 115 passengers. That's significant because it's probably a passenger that carried this information. It was a penny a page to mail something back then, and mailing an entire newspaper would have been insanely expensive. So this was probably in somebody's luggage. And that becomes significant because they actually arrived a day early. They made really good time, but the seas were rough, and they couldn't dock, and they couldn't let the passengers off. The mail was lowered down into tenders and was rowed in. The mail's got to go through. But the passengers, and the passenger was probably carrying this information, didn't get off till nighttime. Earliest he could have mailed it was in the evening. It would go by train from Liverpool to London. Train was traveling about 18 miles per hour. It took about 12 hours to make that trip. That's not from the night, but it's near the time that this would have been mailed. It would have arrived in the morning of December 17th in London, and somehow arriving in the morning, it was still able to be delivered that day, which is kind of incredible. I don't think we could do that now. But all we have is a letter that's gone to a doctor. You got to open that letter. For me, that probably takes 4 or 5 days before I get around to opening my mail. But you got to read it, you got to understand it, you got to decide if you believe it. Do you want to do this? Should we do this? You got to create the inhaler to do it. You got to find ether. Not a lot of regulations about human experimentation back then, but you've got to get volunteers and you've got to satisfy yourself that this is ethical. How long till I use this information that I get in the afternoon of December 17th? Till I use this on a patient? Well, he's pulling teeth at his house Saturday morning. 36 hours. He has the inhaler made. He has the ether. He has volunteers. There was great excitement about this, and he's not even first. William Fraser, the ship's surgeon, is doing minor surgery at his house under ether that morning as well. Another reason to think that it probably was a passenger who talked to the ship's surgeon about the information he was carrying. What was the inhaler that they used? It was a Robinson inhaler. James Robinson described this as a very imperfect apparatus hastily got up. Where did he get the idea for this? He took the bottom of a Knuth apparatus. What is this thing? If you have a cappuccino maker in your house right now, in 1846, you probably would have had the Knuth apparatus. And you put chalk or marble in the bottom of it, you poured water in the top, you poured hydrochloric acid into the bottom, it would release CO2. It went up through a semi-permeable membrane, and you get carbonated water coming out. And sparkling water was felt to be refreshing and healthy, and it was something that people liked to have in their house. And all you had to do was keep a canister of hydrochloric acid in the kitchen. What could go wrong with that? The later version of this uses the middle part of the Knuth apparatus. Here we, have the sponge. The mouthpiece looks a little more convenient. You're not shoving the inhaler in a patient's face. That's kind of nice. Has some valves on it, so you can turn it off, which looks like it would be efficient as well. But we do have a major advance in the ability of this vaporizer to keep patients asleep. It is going to work better than Morton's inhaler. And what's the advance here? Now that you don't have to worry about little pieces of the natural sponge being sucked through the inhaler, which happened with Morton's inhaler, and aspirating the sponge was not a good thing. Now that you don't have to worry about it, the sponge can be torn up. Well, why is that a good thing? Well, the amount of vaporization is proportional to the surface area that the liquid is exposed to. Now you've increased the surface area, and this is going to work a little bit better than Morton's design. Not a huge increase, but a little bit better. The Hooper inhaler, kind of the same concept, same design, nothing fundamentally different about this. I show it only because the Wood Museum does have a Hooper inhaler in their collection. They also have the Squire inhaler. Robert Liston, who was a famous surgeon of the time, heard about what happened on Saturday. He wanted to try this on Monday. He commissioned a chemist to make an inhaler for him. He used the chemist's nephew, who was a medical student, to give the ether. The patient was Frederick Churchill, who was supposed to have his right leg amputated. They removed his leg. He woke up. He asked, when does the surgery start? He didn't know that it had happened. And Liston allegedly announces, this Yankee Dodge beats mesmerism hollow. Did people really talk like this back then? I don't know if there wasn't a little gimmickry to this. So you have the interest in anesthesiology. This is not an administering anesthesia. This is not an important or famous document. This is just something that's in the old medical literature talking about anesthesiology. We're now April of 1847. So we're 4 months after they learn in London about this. The incredulity attending the first reception of the news was, upon its verification, succeeded by an enthusiasm which has ever since held the public and the profession well nigh spellbound. Excusable as this is in a matter of such momentous interest, we fear it has led to a too indiscriminate adoption and a too exaggerated estimate of the value of the remedy. Why are we overestimating how important painless surgery is? Because it doesn't work that often. It's unreliable. And has certainly given rise to practices which are highly derogatory to professional dignity. The theaters of our hospitals have been made scenes of operative display before crowds of fashionables, lords, princes, distinguished foreigners, and the like. And the proceedings within their walls chronicled in the columns of the daily press with all the tact, exaggeration, and conventional phraseology of the penny aligners. Penny aligners were freelance writers that got paid a penny a line. People are writing about this. There's a lot of interest in the newspaper. Tremendous excitement about anesthesia, but it's exaggerated in value because, like, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work, and it doesn't really seem to be that reliable, at least at this point. Where are we in the steps of a vaporizer? Well, we know what we're given. We're knowing that it's ether, but we really haven't advanced all that much farther. Next, we go to John Snow, the first person to make a living as an anesthesiologist. He is the first of us, which is kind of incredible. He was born son of a farmer. He became a medical apprentice, took a pledge of abstinence, was a vegetarian, only drank distilled water, a real health nut. He entered medical school as a freshman or sophomore medical student. He knows some of his medical students were getting sick. His colleagues realized that they were getting sick from the arsenic acid used to preserve cadavers, just kind of by observation figured out what was happening, got his medical degree in 1844, and in 1847, when the news of anesthesia makes it over to England, he dedicates his career to anesthesia. He's also remembered for ending the cholera epidemic of 1852. People thought it was airborne. He used observational skills, didn't seem to be, realized it had to be waterborne, famously removed the Broadwick water pump handle and allegedly ended the epidemic. His treatise on ether, published in 1847, moments after the discovery made it to London. A couple interesting things. He is looking at how temperature is going to affect the pressure of the gas, which is kind of insightful. And he writes, "For the power we have acquired through the discovery of our medical brethren in America of inducing at will and with perfect safety," which kind of hurts the cause, because if it's perfectly safe, doesn't really matter how much you're given, right? As long as the patient's asleep. And then he goes on to say, we can actually use this maybe to learn something about the central nervous system and in general, which is kind of a very forward-thinking thing. But it kind of sets back us a little bit on this, how much anesthesia am I administering question. This is Snow's inhaler. This is a very nice replica. How do we know it's a replica? Because none of these were saved. There are no real Snow inhalers. You have ether that would be put in here, and it was actually like a little bit of maize in there that you'd make a mouse run or something, but the air to flow had to travel over a long surface area to pull up vapor. And then you would put water of a desired temperature around that to deal with the heat of vaporization problem. You could keep the ether warm that way. Kind of a brilliant design for 1847. This is just kind of interesting. This is in the Wood Library collection. It was kind of not really known at first what it was. It was felt to be maybe from the 1880s, probably about forgiving nitrous or something like that. Somebody looked at the maker's mark, and from the maker's mark and the street address, you can often date things. Not a lot of old catalogs exist. They weren't saved, but if you knew where and when it was made, if you knew where it was made, you can often figure out when because of tax records, right? Somebody was paying property tax on that property. You can figure out when the maker was there. And lo and behold, this thing is much older than 1880. It's actually 1847. This is a picture of it as it appeared in a journal in March of 1847. It was actually presented at a meeting in January of that year that they published in March. And this is an early version of Snow's inhaler. It didn't have the water bath around it, so it had the heat of vaporization problem. So he improved upon it, but a very, very old medical device, priceless. And for 10 or 20 years at the Wood Library, they didn't even have this under glass. It was on a table. If you wanted to play with it and put your buddy to sleep, you know, hey, you can put me to sleep, I'll put you to sleep. It was just out there for people to handle and kind of have fun with. And that's part of the attraction of collecting medical instruments, because you don't know what you're going to find, and you're not, you know, you might find something that's really significant or really valuable. So how far does snow get us along our progress here? Well, we know what we're giving, and we can give something consistent if we can keep the temperature somewhat consistent. Is it adjustable? Well, you can't dial it up or down, but you can set it, right? I can set a certain amount that I want to give. It's somewhat simple and practical, I guess. It is portable and maintainable. So we've actually made a relatively major step towards a working vaporizer. Ether puts you to sleep. Are there other things you can inhale that put you to sleep? People are inhaling all sorts of stuff to find out what else might have this magical property. James Simpson, on the night of December 4th, is trying chloroform in his house with Dr. North and Dr. Guy. They wake up, we have something else that we can use for anesthesia. Now, Simpson is an obstetrician, essentially, a midwife. To use anesthesia on a pregnant woman is going to be a little more concerning than just to try ether on a non-pregnant patient. So he's not using this 2 days later. He doesn't start the human experimentation for 5 days. He does it for the first time on November 9th. At the end of the month, he is declaring everyone should get this. It is free of ill effects to the fetus. He has smelled the baby's side of the umbilical cord. He does not smell the chloroform, and therefore it does not get to the baby, and everyone should have this. It's all fun and games until somebody gets hurt. That brings us to Hannah Greener, which is a name I'm sure a lot of you know, the first anesthetic mortality. This is a picture from the internet. It's all over the internet about old anesthesia, and it's actually a depiction of the first anesthetic mortality. So this is Hannah Greener. She was a 15-year-old girl. Dr. Lloyd, who was taking off a toenail. Dr. Megason, who administered chloroform. This is John Rain, who was the brother of her adoptive mother. Kind of looks like he's holding a flask there, right? So she was adopted. For a while, nobody knew who she really was. Somebody figured out she was actually born Hannah Shimpen. Her mother was unwed, which was an unlucky thing for a baby in Victorian times. And even further, mother died during childbirth, which was particularly unlucky, leaving her an orphan. She bounced around from family member to family member, wasn't particularly cared for, had some really bad ingrown toenails. When she hit puberty, her grandfather took an interest in her. There were some problems in the house. People felt that she had to be removed from that household. The Greeners were nice enough to adopt her, but she had these toenails. So the worst of the toenails came off on October 26th. And this was bad. It was necrotic, it smelled, this was a real problem. Hannah wanted it fixed. She wanted anesthesia. She was afraid to wake for this. Mr. had 6 other kids. This was kind of expensive. He was kind of, let's do it on the cheap. Do we have to really do all this? But she really wanted the anesthesia. So they gave her ether, and she didn't go to sleep. Must be a bad batch of ether. They gave her another batch of ether. She didn't really go to sleep. We got 2 bad batches of ether. Let's get another batch of ether. Third batch didn't really put her to sleep all that well. She fought during the entire procedure and struggled. She had no recall, but she got a lot of ether for the time and had a headache for two days afterwards. She was discharged from the hospital 9 weeks later. And you might be thinking, 9 weeks for a toenail removal in 1847? That doesn't sound long enough. She was discharged early. She was kind of a surly 15-year-old, and she was refusing to eat and not cooperating with the nurses. And they said, it's Christmas week, let's get her out of here. So they discharged her early. But she has another toenail that's infected and smelly, and it's a problem. Hannah has now decided she doesn't want this done. She didn't like the ether. And she's saying, just, do it without the ether. Just, cut it off. Dr. Lloyd is saying, no, I really don't want to do that. This is going to be very painful. You don't understand. I don't want to do this without anesthesia. Mr. Greener kind of wants this to happen. We spent all this money, to fix the 1 foot, and you're limping, and you still have this smell coming out of your shoe, and it's ridiculous. We spent all this money, we haven't fixed the problem. We need to get this done. And into the mix comes Dr. Megason, who says, I've got something new. It's called chloroform. It's great. I'll give you the chloroform. It's done in the parlor of the Greener house, so they could recover her at home, so they wouldn't be in the hospital till the toenail grew back. So they were going to do it a little cheaper. Dr. Megason put a teaspoon of chloroform on a handkerchief. He put it up to Hannah's face. She took 2 breaths. She reached up, grabbed his wrist, and pulled the handkerchief from her face. He instructed her to put her hands on her knees, which she did. He put the handkerchief back to her face. When they felt that she was properly anesthetized, Dr. Lloyd put knife to skin. She retracted her foot. He stopped. He looked at Dr. Megason. He expected him to administer more chloroform, but Dr. Megason, to his surprise, did not do that. He motioned for him to wait. He wanted his block to set. They waited a short period of time. He instructed him to proceed. He put knife to skin again. She became rigid. Her face became pale. Her lips changed color. She died. At the coroner's inquest, Dr. Megason testified the whole process of inhalation, venesection, and death could not, I should say, have occupied more than 2 minutes. From the very beginning, when things go badly for us, it goes bad really quickly. And that is from the start. People question whether chloroform should have been used. One of the experts of the day said it was perfectly justifiable. That expert also testified that his efforts to revive the patient were in accordance with the highest authorities' recommendations. That's significant because Simpson testified it wasn't the chloroform that killed her, it was the resuscitation. How was she resuscitated? What was the state of cardiac resuscitation in 1848? ACLS, if you will. This audience knows that really well, but all the things that you know weren't available. So what you had was a fully monitored patient, right? He's got his hand on the pulse and he's looking at her. Full monitoring. If the pulse weakened, you would remove the handkerchief. If she's still breathing, you stop giving the anesthesia. Unfortunately, Hannah was not breathing. So Dr. Megason tried a number of maneuvers designed to stimulate ventilation and respiration. He splashed cold water in her face, and they had a glass of water available, thrown briskly into her face. Hopefully that wakes you up, stop breathing, or you start breathing. And if that had worked, you stop giving the anesthesia. Unfortunately, that didn't work. The water in the face did not start her breathing. So now you escalate. You give her brandy. And that's why John Rain was holding a flask there. Brandy was poured into her mouth, and you swallow brandy, and that's going to stimulate you and wake you up. Wow, that was kind of nasty. Unfortunately, she didn't really have a swallowing reflex at that point. So she had a mouth full of brandy. Dr. Megason kind of manipulated her head, tried to get it to drain. It did. Did it go down her trachea? Did it go down her esophagus? Who's to say? But it did not start her breathing. The end of the algorithm was to bleed her from an antecubital vein or a jugular vein. He did both because of her age, but he could not get more than a teaspoon of blood. After transecting a vein, her heart was not beating, she was dead. Simpson argued that it was the brandy that killed her. It went down her trachea and she aspirated brandy. If you've heard that Hannah Greener died of aspiration, people still say that. And for years I believed, yeah, she probably had gastric aspiration. She had an autopsy. Her stomach was grossly distended with food. She had a big meal just like they told her to, because you lost weight last time and you make sure you have a good meal before you go into surgery, and she did that, but there was reported gastric contents in her trachea, and she was sitting up when she coded. And would a shot of brandy poured into the trachea of a 15-year-old cause death in less than 2 minutes? I find it hard to believe that it would. Probably not a great thing, but 15-year-olds don't surrender life that easily. This is the burial ledger for Hannah Greener, the church she was buried at, and it's kind of interesting. And they record the name and where you were from and the date of your burial and who performed the mass, a Christian burial. There's really no room for why you died. Doesn't really matter why you died. You're being buried. But for Hannah Greener, in the corner there, right, somebody felt it necessary to write, died from the effects of chloroform. Even from the very beginning, there was a sense of, this shouldn't have happened. You shouldn't die from anesthesia. And you could say, well, she was 15. Maybe somebody was upset that she was 15. Above her, John Golightly, who was buried 3 weeks before her, was 16. Nobody really was that concerned about why he died. Young people died back then. But from chloroform, that shouldn't have happened. There are those who will argue that the Pure Food and Drug Act stems from this. Maybe pharmacovigilance, which is the European version of that. The patient safety movement, all that is a little bit of a stretch perhaps, but the question of how much anesthesia am I administering becomes really important, because now it's not perfectly safe. There's a number of devices, thousands, that are developed over this time. I'm going to talk about ones that lasted for a long time, got a lot of use, that I think are really significant. This is not in any way exhaustive. This is a Murphy inhaler. This was used for obstetrical anesthesia. If you read the instructions, there's some interesting things in there. One recommends that you test the chloroform yourself. Good anesthesiologist is going to test it, find out how strong it is, figure out how much they should give the patient. At Jefferson, we actually have a rule against this. We're not allowed to do this, but that's what he recommended. There was also this idea, they were worried about chloroform shocking the heart, shocking the patient, don't give too much too quickly. That's what maybe killed Hannah Greener. So you would breathe through your mouth and your nose for 2 breaths, and then you would pinch your nose for a couple breaths, and then you would breathe through your mouth and nose again, and there was this complicated sort of regimen to try and limit the shock of the patient. Chloroform. This is a picture of the inhaler as it looked probably around that time. You'd have a sponge in there soaked with chloroform. Patient would draw air in. Air and chloroform would get into the patient. But unlike the previous inhalers we've talked about, this was a breathe-back device. The patient would breathe into the inhaler, and it would be vented through a valve there. Why not breathe through the inhaler? Well, you're going to put chloroform in the room, you're going to be wasting the chloroform, things like that. Why is it so important to breathe back into this device then? Well, one, the device is made of metal, it's going to conduct heat better, and you're putting body heat in there, and you're mitigating the heat of vaporization problem. This was on display at the Wood Museum last time I went there, which was about 20 years ago, as an 1847 Murphy inhaler. Well, you got a face mask, not a mouthpiece. And you'll see these in catalogs about 20 years later. I think people got kind of tired of the, breathe through your mouth and your nose at the same time and then pinch and then go back, and it was kind of complicated. And people probably found that to be impractical. But you would not have had a face piece on this device in 1847. This is the Murphy inhaler that they have online now, much later piece, right? You can just tell by looking at it. Though the Wood Museum dates it to 1847. Well, why do they do that? Well, again, this is a difference between the way physicians and historians look at this. This piece is going to be 50, 60 years after that, beyond that piece. And a historian's going to be, well, is it 50 or 60? Which is it? And how do you know that? Well, I don't know exactly, but I can just look at it. And it's much later than 1847. So the Wood Museum, there is logic to this. You date it to when it was initially developed. And that's fine, it's kind of precise, but if you're trying to follow how devices evolve, it becomes very confusing. And it's like putting a classic Corvette next to a Tesla Cybertruck and saying they're from the same time period. It's like these are very different things with very different design influences. This is ornate. It's got black lacquer applied to it. People wanted to show the craftsmanship to make sure it was valuable. This comes after Lister, obviously. People are concerned about being able to sterilize it. They're not going to be as ornate. It's a much later piece. So where are we in terms of the vaporizer? It's giving a consistent amount. It's, because you're dealing with heat of vaporization, it's somewhat simple, not that versatile. It is portable and maintainable. A guy named James Miller comes along, he says, well, anything that will emit ether or emit chloroform vapor being brought fully in contact with the mouth and nostrils, a handkerchief, a towel, a piece of lint, a worse glove, a nightcap, a sponge can be used. And it sort of becomes a thing. You see a lot of reports of anesthesiologists or surgeons delivering anesthesia, but they would go to the house, they wouldn't have anything, they would borrow a glove from the woman of the house or borrow a cap or something, and they'd use it to give the anesthesia and then give it back. I think it was like a thing to show it's my skill and not, and why not bring a handkerchief? And, obviously, you're going to use a glove and it's going to have mucus and probably vomit on it when you give it back. It just seems kind of ridiculous. But this becomes the fashion, and Simpson very much advocates using a handkerchief to give anesthesia for labor. John Snow, who very much wanted to use inhalers after the Hannah Greener incident and to know exactly how much anesthesia you're giving, gets summoned by Queen Victoria in 1853 to give anesthesia for her childbirth. And he decides to use the Simpson technique. The leading expert of the day, I'm going to use a handkerchief. It goes great. She says Dr. Snow gave the blessed chloroform, and the effect was soothing, quieting, delightful beyond measure. The Queen's very happy. She does well. Baby does well. But people are really upset. You gave the Queen anesthesia. Anesthesia kills people. There's a lot of pushback on this. Editorial in The Lancet, we could imagine that anyone had incurred the awful responsibility of advising the administration of chloroform to Her Majesty during a perfectly natural labor with a 7th child. Prince Leopold was actually her 8th child, but you can forgive them for losing count. She's producing babies at a pretty good clip at this point. In no case could be justified to administer chloroform in perfectly ordinary labor, but the responsibility of advocating such a proceeding in the case of the sovereign of these realms would indeed be tremendous. Probably some officious meddlers about the court, and they knew it was Snow, but they used kind of a disparaging thing there. So far overruled Her Majesty's responsible professional advisors as to lead to the pretense of administering chloroform. He is kind of ostracized His future sort of theories and things like that are met with kind of skepticism, disdain. He's widely mocked. 3 years later, he is summoned to give her anesthesia again. It was not a great career move for him, but what are you supposed to do when your queen asks you to do something? So he gives her another perfectly fine anesthetic for the birth of Princess Beatrice. He dies in the Lancet, which was very angry with him. Rather than giving a proper obituary, which would have been a couple pages back then, for a physician of his stature, gave him a 2-line. He died. He experimented with anesthesia a little bit. We appreciate that. This is a man who was not only the first anesthesia specialist, but he also developed epidemiology. He's still remembered as the father of epidemiology. In 2013, lest you think I'm talking about really old stuff, the Lancet decided to publish a proper obituary. The Lancet wishes to correct, after an unduly prolonged period of reflection, 155 years, an impression that may have given. This is a pub in London. It's the John Snow pub. I went there once with my wife, and it's kind of like, why is there a pub? He didn't own a pub. He didn't even drink. He was a teetotaler. And it's got like anesthesia, ether stuff on the walls, and it's like, how can this exist? Who wants to go to a history of anesthesia bar? I've got a room full of anesthesiologists, and you don't want to do that tonight, right? This just can't exist. Honestly, I was there, and it's like, this can't be real. Is this like a weird dream? This cannot exist in nature. And I didn't figure it out for a couple years. I came to Philadelphia. I'm sitting in a restaurant with my wife, and Ben Franklin, at least a reenactor dressed as Ben Franklin, walked into the restaurant, sat at the bar, and ordered a pint of beer. And it's like, Ben Franklin's, came into our restaurant, and it's like, if there was a bar in Philadelphia, I don't know if this bar exists, but it had kites and keys and bits of electricity and lightning in it, it would probably exist. We love Ben Franklin. He's an historical figure that we love in Philadelphia. And the John Snow bar is because he's a beloved historical figure in London. But someone that remains beloved, 155 years later, makes it even more amazing that the Lancet would be so angry that he gave a perfectly fine anesthetic where everyone did well. Blame anesthesia started really early. It started with the first of us. He dies in 1858. This is a picture from 1855. This is speculation that people have made. I have no idea if it's true or not. But while Simpson was playing with chloroform and things like that, Snow was huffing benzene and benzene derivatives. And they kind of mess you up a little bit. You don't get surgical anesthesia from that, but they are nephrotoxic. And he may have died of renal failure. There are people that think these fingers, 3 years before he died, look a little puffy. He may be a little fluid overloaded there. I don't know if that's true or not. But the first anesthesiologist died young, and it may be the job that killed him. While Snow is giving anesthesia to the Queen, a guy named Edward Squibb, pharmaceutical company, trained chemist, went to Jefferson Medical College, working as a surgeon initially at our university. He's going around looking at demonstrations of ether, and they're not working. People have a couple good surgeries, they want to put a demonstration on, they get a crowded room, it fails, and he's done a bunch of these things. He was working for the Navy at this time. But in November of 1854, we're now almost a decade after the first anesthetic, and people are still trying to get this right. He comes to Jefferson, and he notes finally an amputation of a middle-aged woman, done pretty well with ether. It's a little burned around here, right? So he's thinking maybe it's better ether that Jefferson has, and he gets a sample and he compares it to other samples, and it was stronger. Problem was it was stronger than you could than you could manufacture. If somebody got lucky, they got a really good batch of ether, but you couldn't necessarily recreate that reliably. So he figures we've got to distill it, right? When you add flame to ether, bad things happen. Everything he owns is a little bit burned up. His good friend, who was his lab assistant, died in the fire. He had burns on his face and his hands. He eventually realizes that you could boil water, pipe the steam in, distill the ether, safe distance from the flame. Rather than patenting or something, he publishes it freely, so anybody can do, makes good ether available to anybody. He had over 300 inventions or drug discoveries during his time, never held a patent. Firmly believed any discovery that can benefit all mankind should be shared with all men freely. Second myth, the Massachusetts General taught us how to use ether. Actually, Morden said it was something called Letheon. He tried to conceal it was ether. He got patents. He didn't want people to be able to do this without paying money to him. There's a lot of people that you can say really made this accessible, but Squibb's contribution is particularly significant and was given freely to the world. This is a picture of him in later years. His eyelids may look a little bit funny, right? Yeah, he needs a blepharoplasty or something like that. These were actually burn contractures. And at this point, he could not close his eyes. He could forcibly squint to keep his eyes moist, but he couldn't sleep at night. He had to tape his eyes shut because of the burns he got trying to distill ether, and he shared it freely with the world. My timing looks like it's relatively bad. I'm going to run over by about 5 minutes here. If people want to go to lunch, I understand how awful it is for the speaker to run over. But I do have about 5 minutes left. I'm not offended if you walk out. So you have this problem with chloroform. People are dying. Is it something that happens to the heart? And one of Snow's last papers was he thought it was a cardiac issue, cardiac paralysis. Is it something happening to the lungs? Are we killing people by putting them to sleep? Is it something to do with the brain? You might be saying, well, what about blood pressure? Well, there is no blood pressure at this time. The concept won't be invented for about another 30 years. We now know that chloroform sensitizes the heart to catecholamines and can precipitate arrhythmias. Hannah was probably light, and they put the knife to the skin, and there was probably a catecholamine surge, and she had a cardiac arrhythmia. Simpson is arguing that anesthesia is safe, and actually if you have an amputation with anesthesia, you're more likely to live than without anesthesia. And he's probably confusing association and causality. Tractor runs over my leg, and I am so septic or hypovolemic or something, I just let you remove my leg, just lay there. I am less likely to survive that than if I'm thrashing and, get off me and you've got to give me anesthesia. London hospitals are realizing mortality is high with ether, but it doesn't really matter if it's an elective case or a trauma case. But with chloroform, the mortality is lower if it's elective rather than trauma. And again, that's probably the catecholamines, but they didn't know that, right? There's no explanation for that. Why are we suddenly focusing on amputations? Well, the world is getting ready to amputate limbs at a clip that we've never seen before, right? The Yanks are going to go to war. There are a number of published accounts, diaries of the Civil War. I like these things. It's a hobby to read them. They give us some insight into early anesthesia. I'm also kind of interested in the Civil War. This is one of my favorites, and it's one of my favorites for a couple reasons. One, people publish these things to make money. They would have had some sort of motivation maybe to make it interesting. If you don't have an interesting story to tell, it doesn't sell. Private Bellor did not publish this during his lifetime. This diary was lost for 100 years. It was found in an attic when an old lady died and they were cleaning out her house. and there was a trunk with some uniforms and a diary in it. He was a bit of an artist. So there's some sketches in there. The sketches are not of sunsets and landscapes. It's torture and all sorts of terrible things that probably really burdened him and troubled him. He would sketch them for whatever reason. During the Battle of Chancellorsville, on day 2, he did go into the medical tent and he witnessed an amputation scene, which apparently troubled him. There's a pile of limbs under the table. He believed they were using something called chloroform, probably chloroform, may have been ether. The North generally used ether. It would have been rare for them to use chloroform, but they would capture supplies from the enemy and use them. That would happen back and forth. On day 5 of the battle, Private Ballard took his turn to lay upon that table. He added an arm to the limb pile. This is a can of squib ether. This is from my collection. This was found at a medical trash site at Antietam. Antietam, bloodiest day in U.S. history for the military. 22,000 men fell, 10 in the cause of preserving the Union and 12,000 in the cause of rebellion. Huge amount of suffering that day. An important contribution that Squibb made, that surgery and anesthesia became reliable, that the anesthesia worked sometimes, not all, he made it so that the ether always worked. Huge contribution. Where would our specialty be if we went into the Civil War and anesthesia was a gimmick that was unreliable? Our profession probably would have evolved very differently. This can says stronger ether. Stronger than what? It's distilled. It's stronger than ones that aren't distilled. Well, why aren't they all distilled? Well, other people just aren't doing it. The information was out there freely. This can was also sealed empty, held underwater for 4 seconds, because every can was treated that way. If there was an air bubble, the can was rejected. The other reason that the military really liked squib ether was a lot of times you would go to the ether and it would be empty. And that was, you have 3,000 men laying in a field and your ether cans have all evaporated. That was kind of disconcerting. Morton did deliver some anesthesia during the Civil War. That was information that was kind of lost. He was not at Antietam, but he was putting on demonstrations for people. And the person that did deliver this anesthetic at Antietam maybe met Morton, probably at least met somebody that saw one of the demonstrations. So it's like 2 degrees of separation from actually being in Morton's hand. The third myth is most Civil War anesthesia, or most Civil War surgery, there was no anesthetics, and almost everybody got anesthesia. Clover's apparatus, while we're settling our military or political differences, Clover comes up with the idea, let's put a certain amount of ether in a bag. Now you know the concentration, and all you have to do is carry this great big bag of gas around to your patients. Can you imagine doing this, walking around the hospital with this bag? This is what it looks like. It was a gold beater's bag. It had a cow intestine lining to protect the rubber from the chloroform. There's a number of surgical commissions looking at the ether chloroform problems, the chloroform mortalities. They highly recommend limiting the chloroform to 4% using Clover's bag. I'm going to skip a number of slides here. We're not going to talk about Junker's apparatus because I'm going to wrap this up so everybody can have lunch. But there's one more thing that we just absolutely need to talk about here. So this is Harcourt's inhaler, Vernon Harcourt. This is a very nice, very complete set that's actually in my now. It'll be in the Wood collection, when I pass away. And it should be in a national collection. When this thing was offered me, even though I stopped collecting a number of years ago, it was like, I've got to buy this thing. It's even got the little glass beads in it, the blue and glass beads. How did this thing work? The early ones were numbered. This is 460 something, I can't read on the slide here, 462 maybe. Put the glass beads in the chloroform, what does that do for you? They're different densities. That's a Galileo thermometer, right? So you know that the chloroform is at a certain temperature. Now you have a dial that you can rapidly change a known concentration of gas with a known proportion of room air. So now you can dial this up and dial it down as you need to. It's absolutely brilliant. This is what the original prototype looked like. You could heat it with flame. This is a historical picture of anesthesia, but they're using this device. This was published in 1906 in October. When is this picture from? Well, Theodore Coker clamps, right? Thyroid surgery guy, won the Nobel Prize for medicine. He's in the picture. And we can date when he was in London, so we know it's May of 06. And there's a couple interesting things here. One, they're using oxygen. They're not using room air. They're actually using oxygen, which is pretty amazing. It looks like the chloroform's actually in a water bath, and it looks like there might be there's something straight in there. It looks like there might actually be a mercury thermometer. They would exist back then. They'd be really expensive. This was a really forward-thinking hospital. Usually this device would be either on like a Christmas tree sort of thing. It might be worn around the anesthetist to keep it upright. We do have one in the Wood collection right now, not nearly as complete. It's not dated either, it's much later. So how did this work? So this is a description of surgery using it. Male 32 for cerebral tumor, induction 0.5 to 2%, 10 minutes, restless 15 minutes, during operation 2%, 1%, then 0.5%. Final sewing up caused movement, 2% given, duration 40 minutes. Patient regained consciousness 5 minutes after cessation. Is that familiar? Does that make sense? Patient, we lay in the anesthetic, he started to move a little bit, we dialed it up, right? I can sort of recognize that. It's a craniotomy done skin to skin in 40 minutes. I don't recognize that. The patient's not intubated, he's spontaneously ventilating, and I'm sharing the airway with the surgeon. There are things here that don't really correlate to what I do. Two more cases. Woman 50, exploratory trephining, patient alcoholic, induction prolonged, narcosis light, talking, 2% required for induction, versus a male age 15, removal of testicle, only 0.5 to 1% required for induction. Well, of course, alcoholics have higher max, right? We all know that. Well, that wasn't known back then. If you didn't know how much anesthesia you were giving, you didn't make those associations that some patients need more than others. So this device really allows for the birth of our specialty as we kind of recognize it. So I think the Harcourt device is a very, very interesting thing and a significant advance, even though it was only used for a number of years. Had a lot of attachments, tended to break a little bit. But it takes us very close to the modern vaporizer. And just because I like to bring everything back to Jefferson, Samuel Gross, in his classic textbook, writing about the value of anesthesia in, I guess, 1866, now that anesthetic agents are so much in vogue, it is seldom that we are obliged to tie our patients or roll them up in sheets and aprons, as was the custom prior to the discovery of these most useful remedies. And with that, I thank you for your attention.